Okay, so I'm now presenting to a blank screen with no audience, which is never fun, but I will do my best. So the topic of today's talk is rewilding Agile. So I'm picking up on that big movement in ecosystem management, which basically says you don't try and restore what is in the past, but you actually create a natural balance in things. And I want to start with an illustration of that. So if you search on Google for wolves, trophic cascade, Yellowstone, you'll find a wonderful video which talks about what happened to Yellowstone National Park when they reintroduced a pack of wolves. Because when wolves were exterminated, it meant there was no predator for the deer. So the deer grazed everything, including riverbanks. Riverbanks therefore eroded, water got polluted, everything went wrong with the ecosystem. When they reintroduced a pack of wolves, then the deer were predated and balance was restored. And within a few years, the water ran clean again. So there's an underlying metaphor here that there is in any complex ecology, you need a diversity of species, a diversity of approaches. And that's something I'll return to at the end. Now, there's another metaphor here, because if you go back to the origins of Agile, and we're now 20 years in, as of early next year, then you get, there's a certain sort of wildness about it. It basically gives some broad principles about changes we want to achieve in software development. And that's, if you look at this picture, which is a timber wolf, kind of like is in the wild, then there may be 2 or 3 different types of wolves, or canines rather, wild dogs, there's wolves and so on. The trouble is when you domesticate things, you get this sort of phenomenon. So within 7 generations, you've got massive apparent diversity of the system, but overall the species has become non-resilient. So to some extent, this is a metaphor for what happened to Agile. It started off with an integrated idea based on broad principles, which was about change, largely based on XP, I think. Then it becomes highly codified with Scrum, with Kanban, with SAFe, and so on. And everybody's setting up their own particular brand of Agile, their own particular breed. And gradually, as a whole, the system has lost resilience. Now, there are several reasons for that. And really what I'm going to be arguing for as I go through this is we need to get the wild flower gardens back, because most of Agile has become highly structured methods. That's kind of like formal gardens. It's kind of like we probably need a compromise, and I've shown the PADI files here. And any ecosystem is always only as resilient as the balance of species available within it. So if we look at some of the current problems with Agile, first is a metaphor here that a lot of Agile is actually a sheep in wolves clothing, in terms of the way it works. So I'll make that point. But first of all, Agile wouldn't have scaled if it hadn't been for Scrum. I've had this argument with XP people a lot, because it would be Agile as a method would have been more authentic to the principles if XP had scaled. The problem is that it required a high level of abstraction and codification, which went with Scrum, which of course starts about 4 years before Agile anyway. And that allows the whole principle to take off, because codification, abstraction, structure mean that something will scale, whereas just an abstract set of principles won't. That meant it scaled, but then you got Scrum created effectively a model by which people would create a method, create a certification scheme, and so on. And so this is a paradox. You don't scale without structure, but structure means you lose some of the initial dynamism. And I'll talk about ways to overcome that in a minute. Certification, to be quite honest, has become a scam. Although there are some authentic methods out there, the vast majority of them are turn up on a course, do an open book exam, pay money every year to read some slides, and you've got a certificate or a set of initials after your name. If you look at the real professions, lawyers, accountants, accreditation is won over years of a mixture of theory and practice. And this is a real problem with Agile, because it results in this proliferation of different individual methods and terms. The third problem is that those methods themselves, and I'm going to use another metaphor here, there'll be a lot of metaphors today, Effectively, they create recipe books rather than training chefs. Now, this is important. When I first went to university, I got given a recipe book. I hadn't really cooked much before. I had to learn from the recipe book. And I did that by assembling all of the right ingredients and following the structured guide. But as I got more competent, and I've got lots of recipe books now, I very rarely follow them because they're just a source of ideas. And as you gain more experience, practice, and you gain more understanding of the theory of taste, yeah, then it's that ability to put the two together. So if you invite a recipe book user into your kitchen to cook it with the right equipment, they fail. Whereas a chef can come in and cook a brilliant meal with whatever you happen to have lying around, because they've got this mixture of what Aristotle calls Sophia and Pronesis, theoretical knowledge and practice. And most of Agile at the moment is highly structured methods. It's recipe book users with very few actual chefs. Or if the chefs are there, so I've seen safe implementations which work, but they largely work because they've got some really good consultants who kind of like ignore most of it and just use it as a coat rack over which they hang good practice. The second problem is following other people's journey. This is what we call the Spotify problem. Spotify basically say there isn't such a thing as a Spotify model. There's what they're currently doing as a result of a journey. And this is an important principle. It will come into complexity theory in a minute. If somebody has lived a journey, what has evolved out of that journey is a unique product of that journey. You can't replicate the end point, but you can replicate the starting conditions. And again, I'm going to come back to some ideas on that at the end. Then we get into the most misused word in the whole of Agile. There's this belief that Agile is empirical, and this is a misuse of the term. They actually mean phenomenological. What empiricism means in Agile is I've done this a few times and it's worked for me, therefore I assume it will scale. Now, actually, empiricism in science is about other people validating and repeating your experiments. So far too many Agile methods and tools have come out of limited experience, and they really haven't been tested outside of context. As a related factor on that, you get the confusion of correlation with causation. So most management books and all Agile books that I've seen, well, with a couple of exceptions I'll come to, basically go and study 8 or 9 cases, and from those cases they derive general rules. Now, say you can't do this. The fact that 70% of American companies have managing directors who play golf doesn't mean that you can substitute golf lessons for a management education. If any country in Europe wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it wins, all it needs to do is increase dark chocolate consumption, because dark chocolate consumption per head of population and Nobel Prizes per head of population directly correlate over several decades. And there's more data than that than is behind most management textbooks. And then finally, and this is kind of like the books which aren't even case-based, so I'll take Reinventing the Organization as a good example of that. You have somebody who has a firm ideological belief in how things should be, and then they'll actually go and collect partial evidence to support that belief. They don't actually double check or validate their evidence. So all of these things are current problems. We know about them. It doesn't mean we haven't got a lot of benefit out of Agile, but if we want it to continue beyond the first 2 decades, we've got to think differently. So let me throw some raw science in up front on this. This is kind of like key to understand. So this is from a whole body of experiments. If you give a group of radiologists a batch of X-rays and you ask them to look for anomalies, such as cancer nodules, for example, and on the last X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of the average cancer nodule. And on average, 83% of radiologists won't see it, even though their eyes physically track it. This is called inattentional blindness. We do not see what we do not expect to see. And part of the problem with highly structured methods is that they effectively frame the way you see the world, so you don't see exceptions. It's why these methods often work for a long period of time before they fail catastrophically, because we literally don't see the exceptions, we don't see the anomalies. The other thing that this reference to a gorilla also makes, which is important, is it invalidates a lot of systems analysis, or things like story points, because the way you actually listen to what people say, the way you perceive what they do, is fundamentally biased by what you're expecting to see. And that leads into some of the work we're doing at the moment, which is actually how do you map unarticulated needs rather than articulated needs within the system. And I'll make a general statement now. It seems to be one of the big important things in IT for the future is not to get faster production of what people say they want, but to find ways in which technology can match the needs that they haven't yet articulated. And one of the important factors on that is the speed of change of technology is far faster than people's perception of their need. It's called an affordance in biology. They actually don't realize that things are now possible, therefore they don't bother to ask for them. So this concept of unarticulated need as a new form of systems analysis is quite like key. But also with it, you get this increasing co-evolution between the capabilities of IT and the thing that users haven't articulated. So to get really pragmatic about this, one of the methods that I created 30 years ago when we set up the SDM, which we've now revitalized as a method, is called T4AT. So what it does is it gets a bunch of prototypers together with a bunch of users in an intensive one-day workshop. This is called joint application design, something that the Agile community has forgotten about and needs to remember, because there's a whole body of methods. So I get this intensive interaction over 8 hours between people who are really fast to prototype systems and users who are exploring what they could do with the prototypers. This, by the way, is actually much more effective as a needs requirement capture exercise than anything else. But I don't stop with that. At the end of 8 hours, I've got a working prototype and some sketches. I then pass that on to another team. The first time we did this, the first team was in Farnborough, which is near London. We then pass it on to a team in Mumbai in India and said, this is the output, can you improve it? You've got 8 hours. We didn't tell them the initial requirement, we just showed them what we produced. So for 8 hours, they got to work on it, and at the end of the 8 hours, they pass it on to a team in California who got the same instruction. And then the next morning, we woke up, got the group together again, and saw what had happened over 2 mutations. Now, every time I've done this process, users have looked at the outcome and said, God, I wouldn't have thought of that. Can I please have it? So you'll notice 2 things here. We're increasing the interaction between technical staff and users, but then we're deliberately creating in a short life cycle mutation. So we get novelty into the system and then review to see whether that novelty should go into it. This is one of a body of techniques which we're loosely categorizing as pre-scrum techniques in Agile, things you do before you even get into a backlog. And again, what I'm trying to illustrate here is once you understand natural science, it's much easier to develop methods. The other key thing is to understand complexity, and I'm not going to go into the Canevin framework in much detail here. There's a lot online. If you look at Liz Keogh's YouTube videos on how to use Canevin in software development, there's a lot of really good material here. The key point I want to make is that a complex system is entangled. Alicia Gerrard uses the metaphor of like bramble bushes in a thicket. So those are the sort of very thorny growths with berries on them, which you find if you go walking in the country, which entangle themselves with trees and with plants. If you pull one strand, you don't know what's going to happen. You can't disentangle it. I've given a visual metaphor here of these are fishing nets piled one on top of each other. The fishermen know what sequence to pull them off, but if you just tugged on something, you create more entanglement. So an entangled system is very important because everything is connected with everything else, and you don't know the consequences of what you do. In fact, the only thing we can say with absolute certainty about a complex system is that any intervention will produce unintended consequences, and therefore you have to manage for those. They can actually, by the way, be beneficial. But it also means we need to shift away from these very linear design processes. There's a point where we move into a linear process, and the great strength of Scrum is its ability to make something which is partly understood but not complete into something which is highly structured and which can scale. But we need to do things around that, and we need to recognize that when users get hold of things, there'll be a problem. Now, there are three basic design principles that you need to take into account here. And the field, by the way, is known as anthro-complexity, the study of complexity in human systems. First is granularity matters. So smaller things generally can combine and recombine in novel ways better than bigger things. So if I look at organizational structures, if I have a rigid hierarchy, it's very difficult for it to evolve. On the other hand, if I have lots of small groups, and here we can use the Dunbar sequence, groups of 5, less than 5, less than 15, less than 150, each of those type of groups has very different dynamics. And if I organize in smaller groups, then the groups can combine and recombine very quickly to meet unanticipated or unexpected needs. The same is true of information. One of the reasons the internet works so well is that things like Twitter and Facebook are dealing with highly fragmented information sources with high levels of human interaction and human interpretation. And that means that completely novel structures, including some quite nasty ones, look at populism in politics, can emerge quite quickly. So smaller things that can combine and recombine very quickly gives you a more resilient system, and that has implications for software architecture. The second principle, and this comes back to the fact that you will not see a gorilla, or at least 83% of you won't see it even when your eyes scan it, is you need to radically diversify cognition. So in some of our work, for example, and I'll show you examples of that in a minute, we'll take a business problem and we'll present it to 1,000 people in real time and allow them to interpret that problem and add their own scenarios about the future without any consultation or any collaboration between any of the actors. This is called wisdom of the crowds. And then from that, we'll draw maps which show what people have in common and what is different. And we'll also use that to generate completely novel ideas. So we're in a much bigger network with diversity of culture, educational background, ethnographics, etc., etc. So in a complex system, you can't do all the processing in the center. You have to distribute a lot of the processing into the network. And the final one is disintermediation. Sorry, it's flipped slides and I won't risk going back. Maybe I can, yeah, okay. Disintermediation means removing the interpretive barriers between the decision maker and the raw data. So in large-scale decision support, for example, we'll put senior executives of a company in direct contact with raw stories of customers. And in software development, we'll put development teams in contact with the raw anecdotal experiences expressed both orally and visually of their users, rather than interpreting that experience into story points, because then you reduce the chance of weak signal detection and you radically increase innovation. So those are three basic principles that it's worth remembering. The other key thing here, and this applies to the whole issue about scalability in Agile, is you don't scale a complex adaptive system by aggregation or imitation. So you don't say this is work, we'll do more of it. You actually decompose it to a low level of granularity and allow it to recombine. So again, I'll use the biological metaphor. The whole of organic life form is based on DNA, which is different combinations of 4 basic chemical compounds. So one of the things I would look for example, in Scale Agile is look at a highly successful team like Scrum and say, well, what are the grains in this? So for example, a sprint is a discrete or a coherent unit within the Scrum method. Well, what happens if I vary that? So for example, take a 2-week sprint and make it 3 months. Well, that's more of a time box. What if I add something in, like I can vary the delivery or vary the resource within limits? Yeah, that's an MVP, but I will always guarantee delivery on a specific time. So you see what I'm doing? I'm going down a level beyond the highly structured methods and say, what are the coherent elements of this? And can I recombine them to create something novel or different? Now that links in with the key message I'm trying to get across here, is that you need to allow people to use different methods and different tools in different contexts. The complete modernization of the field, by which you have to be safe, or you have to be Kanban, or you have to be Scrum, is actually quite dangerous, because all of those tools or techniques work in one context, but they don't necessarily work in another. The other thing is people work differently. This cartoon makes that point. We don't all drive to work in the same car. We don't all actually sit on the same type of seat. We don't all eat the same food. Yeah, different people have different cognitive styles, different physical styles. Different people work in teams in different ways. And fundamentally, we need software to become more of a sort of craft industry in a sense, and less of an industrial combine with these high manufacturing metaphors. So allowing people to choose different tools or actually make choices about different tools is key. Now, interestingly, if you look at it in the medical profession, this is common. So you will not find, surgeons will not always perform an operation or deal with a disease in exactly the same way. They'll use different tools or different methods or different combinations. The system is more adaptive, because though it's coupled, the coupling is loose, it's not tight coupling. So by having a multi-method approach, we can allow more diversity in the workforce. And if people can choose some of their own tools within constraints, then they become more productive. I mean, this is known from a whole body of theory. So we need that sort of variety in the system. The other thing is to kind of like think more about the management. This is a blackberry. This is actually my bramble bush, yeah, if you want the example. And if you look at the origin of the word manage in English, it has two origins. One is the Italian maneggiare, which my pronunciation is terrible, so I apologize for that, which means to train horses. It then gets corrupted by the French to mean household management. So effectively, you have two types of management, right? You have menage and this riding a horse, as opposed to managing a household budget. Now, we need both types. My argument in part is highly structured methods. The level of control is the budgetary control. It's not the co-evolutionary nature of a relationship with a horse. So we need to sort of restore both those types of management into the way we work. And that's a direct quote from that article, which is on our website. Now, one of the key things to allow this diversity is the concept of scaffolding. Now, this is kind of like part of a 2-year body of work we've been doing. We recognize that design thinking, rather like Agile, was becoming highly commodified. And if you don't know it, the time when you introduce new things is when everything else is being homogenized or commodified. So you can see it with Agile at the moment, you can see it with design thinking. And this links in with what Clayton Christensen famously called competence-induced failure. When one idea becomes dominant and there's inadequate variety in the system, then basically it's on the verge of collapse. You see the same thing politically, by the way. Neoliberalism homogenized the left and right politically in Europe and the States, and that meant the energy cost of populism went down. So actually the system got radically disrupted. However, that's for another day. Now, what we've been doing for the last 2 years is to work with professors of design at MIT, at Stanford, in RAND Corporation, and quite a few of our network, and about 50% of this work has been software development and Agile, in creating a radical new approach to design thinking. So the current double diamond of design thinking effectively is a form of expert ethnography and expert ideation, or ideas generation. We're now working on distributed ideation and distributed ethnography, which gives us 4 states. So I have traditional design thinking, which is expert-based. I can distribute the ethnography, which means a huge amount of micro-narratives of people's day-to-day experience expressed within a quantitative framework. And I can use that to allow experts to ideate, to come up with novel ideas. So I give them more diversity. That's the unarticulated need concept. Or I can take an idea and I can present it to 1,000 people and get them all to interpret it and come up with ideas in real time, so they don't influence each other, and that's distributed ideation. And then if I get really radical, I combine the two, and I say, how can I repurpose things that I already am highly competent at to do something completely novel? And if you want the great example of that in our industry, IBM dominated computing for 4 or 5 decades because they were the previous world experts in punch cards to control machines. And so they got first mover advantage in terms of the use of software and computing. The EU handbook on crisis and complexity management, which I've authored, which is coming out next month, actually says the key thing to exit from a crisis is to radically repurpose existing capabilities rather than invent novel ones. Now, the other concept aside from that is a concept of scaffolding. And traditionally, people tend to think of this as a sort of steel scaffolding, which surrounds a building. But that's external scaffolding. You can also have internal scaffolding. So, for example, mammals have an endoskeleton, not an exoskeleton. So you get a massive amount of variety in mammals, but the underlying pattern, the skeleton structure, of backbone and limbs doesn't change much. I mean, whales have exactly the same structure as humans, but there's variety within it. And so the way we're moving on software architecture, and this is a whole new field, if you're interested, get in touch, is that you actually define a scaffolding type, which could be internal or external. It could be a nutrient scaffolding, which is designed to disappear once the structure is emerged. There's a whole typology of these things. And then you define how people and software objects interact with each other and with the scaffolding. And you allow applications to emerge from that interaction, which means you don't get locked into something like SAP as a transaction-based system. You actually have systems which can rapidly be repurposed, elements can be slotted out, and we can get complex levels of interaction. That idea is going across as well to mental health in the population, but that, again, is a separate subject. But this concept of entangling things around points of coherence, so define standard input-outputs and allow things to combine in novel and unexpected ways, is actually kind of like, I think, key to the survival of agile and software development. And the final point I want to make is you've got to stop talking about endpoints. So culture is everything, but you can't engineer a culture. A culture is an emergent property. So I thought I'd show you a culture map. This is from work we've done a lot of now, by which you gather people's stories about their day-to-day existence. You get them to self-interpret those stories into a quantitative framework where they don't know what the right answer is. This is very different from questionnaires. And then we draw these maps, which are called dispositional maps or fitness landscapes. So in this case, we presented a sort of future vision of the company, a vision of what we want to be, to the whole workforce. They've all indexed it, added their own stories of their own experience to that, and some scenarios about the future, and we've drawn the map. And you can see there are distinct cultures. There's a blue, a green, a purple, and an orange culture. And the blue one is fairly distinct. It's kind of like in a different place. So if my ideal place is the omega point, the orange culture, and I've put it in the top right of the matrix because that's where good things are meant to go, then the alpha to omega leap is too far. If anybody's ever walked in the mountains, you know what it's like. If you have a horseshoe walk, you climb up to, say, 2,000 or 3,000 feet or meters, and then you walk around the ridge. That's a lot easier than diving down the mountain, walking across river valleys and climbing straight up again. It's easier to keep to the contour. So here, if I want to achieve cultural change, I don't say to everybody, we want you to be like omega, because it's too far away. I look for a stepping stone, and that's the beta step, which is where blue overlaps with purple and green, so they've got a lot in common. And I literally click on that part of the map and I read the stories. And I say to the guys in alpha, how can we create more stories like these? Then click on the alpha area and say fewer stories like those. Now that's called vector of theory of change. More stories like that, fewer stories like these can engage huge numbers of people. And once the system shifts to beta, then I can shift it to gamma, only then can I shift it to omega. This is used for cultural mapping, it's used for customer attitudes and everything else. But I'm showing it because it shows that culture isn't a causal factor. Culture is an emergent property. So people need to stop talking about agile culture and agile mindset, because both of those happen as a result of the way that people interact and the structure we put into place. So I thought I'd finish off with Rudyard Kipling. This is from a wonderful story about how the dog was domesticated, how the cat was domesticated. And the purpose of the story is the cat refuses to be domesticated. He wants the benefits of the cave and the warm milk and the warmth, but he also wants to be the cat who walks by himself and all places are alike unto him. So I'll leave you with one final sort of suggestion is people who are owned by cats. I am owned by 2 white cats. One of them is currently crawling around me wanting me to stop work. People who are owned by cats understand complexity. People who own dogs are trying to avoid it. Thank you very much for your time.